my name is Nathalie Mat. I'm a registered dietitian. Someone sitting next to me said, "What are you doing here?" And I feel like I'm kind of here to provide a scientific break, and instead of looking outside, we're going to look inside a little bit. In terms of the periodic table, we're just going to be zooming in to minerals. I'm also a walker, so I'm going to have to stand still. But we're going to be talking about minerals and how it affects you and me, basically, and I'm going to give you some insight on what I do on a daily basis. I will not be here for lunch, but I've left my details up, so you are welcome to contact me if you have any questions. I am aiming to be done in 30 minutes, but when I get excited, I talk a little bit fast. So you might find that I finish just a little bit early. All right, so what are we going to do? I want to give you the overall picture of what the body's going to look like. And then for our big picture people who know what's coming up, we're going to talk about minerals and then our trace minerals that are inside the body. And how I, as a dietitian, think, instead of thinking at the very bottom about our atoms down here, I tend to start with the whole person. So the whole person sitting in front of me is a composite of many different things. And as you see, we go down from the little baby, we walk down to the organ system. And so here's the digestive system. Obviously, I'm biased. That's the one I'm going to look at. But you've got so many systems that work all together, your neuroendocrine system, all of them. And then we move from the organ system into the organ, which we've got different components of, down to the tissues, down to the individual cells. And inside each cell, we have organelles that then are full of these amazing compounds and macromolecules like DNA, or even things like carbohydrates, fats, and we move down to eventually the atoms. And so when you and I are sitting here, we are amazingly a huge bag of chemical reactions that are living and breathing and digesting the tea we just had. And I'm always amazed that as we find out more, I feel like we still know nothing. Alrighty. So I found this graphic, which I really liked, which tied in today's theme, which talks about the human body ingredients that we would find on the periodic table. And I was quite surprised. I didn't think of us as 65% oxygen, but if you consider that we are about 70% water, we are mostly chemical reactions happening in an aqueous environment, then it kind of makes sense. And then carbon, of course, is the backbone for many of our compounds. From a dietitian's perspective, it just immediately makes me think of all of our nutrients, but even within our cells, and then hydrogen, the other part of the oxygen, and nitrogen is, of course, what we have in our proteins and amino acids, which aren't just for muscles, but they're also for enzymes and for all kinds of chemicals that do a lot of interacting. And so my next two slides, I've zoomed in a little bit on that, but I know, oh, you can actually see it okay. We can't always see it so well. And then down the other side, we've got the other key elements, and these I will talk about in a little bit more detail. But the reason I like this picture so much is because when you look at it, I get a vision of the atom, where we always have the nucleus, and spinning around the nucleus we've got all of the electrons. And that is in part what we are. We're a bunch of atoms all interacting together. We're not space though, like we're quite solid feeling. All right. So in terms of levels of sufficiency, one thing that I want to remind you about is that we don't just have optimal levels and deficient levels. There is actually a range, and going from the very top, we have toxicity, so when you are taking in more than you need, and then we have below that our optimal levels. But this is not where I see many people. I would actually say that most of the people that I see in my practice who are not feeling great, their energy levels are not amazing, they're sitting at a suboptimal range. And if we test their blood values, keeping in mind that your blood values do not necessarily represent your tissue level, and so do not necessarily represent whether you are in range or not. These people are often in a normal range on a blood test. And only once you have decreased a person's stores, which sometimes you can't even test in their blood, some elements you can, will they start developing a deficient state. And only when they're really, really deficient will you see something like an iron deficiency, anemia, or I will see things on their fingernails, or I will see things on their tongue that will tell me this person has a vitamin B deficiency or an iron deficiency. And so sometimes you can look at a person and you have no idea of their deficiency status. And in South Africa, there is something very well documented referred to as hidden hunger. And that's where South Africans are missing. They might have enough food, but they do not have enough vitamins and minerals. And I will talk a little bit about that. Alrighty, so I want to give credit where it's due. There is this wonderful guy, you can't see his name, it is Martin Kohlmeyer, who is a pharmacologist who did most of my homework for this presentation. And you're welcome to challenge some of the things he says if you want to chat more about it. But how I have taken our example minerals is I talk about the main functions, and with a lot of these, you will know them. And I'm half tempted to get people from the audience to tell me what the main function is before I let it go. And then I've also put in some interesting stuff, which is the other functions that minerals do, because they're not just, it's not like you only need iron for red blood cells. You need them for a lot of things. The same with calcium. And so I've listed some other functions and then some interesting things on absorption, because you aren't only what you eat, but also what you can absorb. And in some of these nutrients, absorption is quite complicated. Not as complicated as, say, our B vitamins, which are vitamin B12 in particular, has quite complex absorption. But there are a lot of things that can interfere. And then, of course, I've spoken about food sources as well as interesting things about an excess. So I'm going to start with calcium. And I've already cheated and given you all of the info about calcium and said it's for bones, it's bones, it's bones. So I'm not going to test you on this one. We know it is the major bone in mineral, and it actually occurs inside the mineral, inside the bone itself. It is a crucial component of the bone. And in a young man, you might have as much as 1.4 kilograms of calcium. The average adult woman has about 1.2 kilograms. But it does many other things in terms of communications and hormone-like signaling. So I wouldn't be surprised if at least 1 or 2 people in this room are on calcium channel blockers as medication, or are on something that would influence how quickly calcium moves in and out of the cells, because it's involved in neurotransmission and also muscle contraction. When a muscle contracts, there is the use of both calcium and magnesium to get that muscle fiber to shorten and then to let go again. And imbalances in these are part of the reason why we experience deficiency symptoms. And I've said many more because, oh my gosh, there's so many. There's so many. Our absorption, this is one that is very highly affected by everything else going on in the body. So you will see with some of my absorptions, some of our minerals are literally all absorbed. But calcium is affected by several things, and one of the most important things is vitamin D. Now, how many people in this room know their vitamin D status? I'm getting a lot of blank stares. I've got one person who is very, very happily throwing her hands in the air. I will tell you that the statistics vary considerably, but one of the studies that I read recently said that 7% of South Africans are deficient, and I will tell you that I don't think that is accurate, because in my practice, most of the women, not so much the men, but most of the women I measure are very low. And so even though we live in a sunny city and a sunny country, we don't spend time in the sun. And if we have dark skin, then it takes us much longer to produce the same amount of vitamin D that we would get if we have lighter skin. And so vitamin D status is very important for iron absorption. And if your vitamin D is low, you are more likely to be on the 15% absorption side rather than the 70% absorption. And then also to remember with all minerals is that if you have, for any reason, had surgery on your digestive system, and only dietitians would think about this, but if you've had surgery on your small intestine and they've chopped out a section, you might be missing a section that absorbs a certain nutrient. And so absorption could be affected. Part of this is because we make different kinds of receptors along our digestive systems. And if you make a different receptor or for each thing, then every single item will be well absorbed. But some of our mineral receptors actually absorb more than one mineral, and so you can have a competition if you are supplementing with only one. All right, I'm not going to talk this much about each one, I promise. Then vitamin D is a potent stimulus for calcium absorption. Just to recap, it is a fat-soluble vitamin that we do make when we're exposed to the sun, and there aren't a lot of food sources for it, for vitamin D. You will see sometimes if you read things on the internet that there's vitamin D in dairy, but in South Africa we don't fortify our dairy with vitamin D. So unless you're getting things from cod liver oil or fatty fleshed fish, there's a little bit in eggs, you're not really going to be getting much vitamin D. Spend a little bit of time in the sun. Phosphates can inhibit the absorption of calcium, and this we find in milk, meat, colas, and many processed foods. And then oxalates and phytates also inhibit absorption. I don't know that anyone knows what an oxalate or a phytate is. Knows. There's a yes somewhere. Well done. So an oxalate and a phytate are both plant chemicals. They're found in things like our spinach, rhubarb, a lot of our dark green leafy veggies, and also in some of our fibrous foods. And so the foods that we think, like if I'm eating my breakfast cereal in the morning with my milk, you might actually get a little bit of an inhibition when you are eating that mixed meal. In terms of losses, if you are not at risk of osteoporosis, this doesn't make as much of a difference. But if you are at risk of osteoporosis, you do not want to have a high salt intake. There are other reasons why we don't want to have a high salt intake, and I'll talk about those later, but having a high salt intake can increase your urinary calcium losses, and then also profuse sweating can increase your losses significantly. Now, for my food sources, I must credit the source of these pictures. They came from a very useful infographic made by a company called Lifehack. And I think Lifehack have a vegetable bias because all of their sources, and you'll see them, always start with the veggies first and then they move on to like the animal products later. And so just so that you are primed, this does not mean that broccoli is a better source of calcium than dairy or sardines. And basically what happens is, in terms of a bioavailability, you will absorb the calcium inside dairy has the same bioavailability as the calcium inside, say, broccoli or spinach, with the caveat that there is much more calcium inside your dairy produce. We also, and people will be surprised to see things like sardines as a source of calcium, but this is because we tend to eat the soft bones. So when you are eating these fish, don't take the bones out. Please eat them. They are a wonderful source of bioavailable calcium. It is important to know, people didn't like that statement, I'm sorry. Sorry. It is important to note that if you are at risk of calcium stone formation in your kidneys, excess supplementation can be a real problem. And if you aren't supplementing but you're still getting stones, it is important that you drink water throughout the day and chat to a dietitian. If somebody is supplementing with calcium, they do not need more than 500 milligrams of calcium, in part because of some research that came out that found in particular people, not everyone, that this can lead to increased deposition of calcium inside your arteries and veins. In other words, making them stiff. We don't want that. It'll increase your cholesterol, increase your blood pressure. So if you do supplement, a dietitian's perspective is always food first, supplements as a backup, as needed. But if you do supplement with calcium because you need it, maybe you're on a dairy-free diet, then 500 milligrams is enough at a time. Moving on to potassium. Now, potassium is one that a lot of people don't know about, but it's actually, like from a dietitian's perspective, it's pretty important. I'm going to talk a little bit of science, which I know will not be lost on this audience, and everyone will think, Natalie, this is the easiest of easy chemistry, but is the main cationic osmolyte within cells. Basically, there is lots of potassium inside cells, and sodium, our next one, there is lots of sodium outside cells. And this is part of how we maintain the cell at rest, and it is a really important part of how we have nerve conduction or impulse conduction within the human body. And potassium is incredibly important for signaling in the brain, in the heart, and it is also useful for a lot of metabolism, a lot of metabolite and nutrient transport. The reason for this is a lot of our cells, if not all of our cells, have potassium-sodium pumps, and they actually, as our chemicals move into our body or through from our digestive system into our cells and then from those cells into the blood, sodium and potassium are normally being moved in and out of cells to facilitate that transport. And so potassium is incredibly important. It is also really useful for the activation of enzymes. And enzymes are the workers of everything that is going on inside our bodies. One slightly higher up level that I like to talk about is the DASH diet. Has anyone heard of the DASH diet? No. This is an amazing diet. It is an adaptation of the Mediterranean diet. It stands for Dietary Adaptations to Stop Hypertension. And hypertension is a very big problem in South Africa. Now, when I was a dietetics student, I thought the only important part of the DASH diet was that you used a dash less salt. I was wrong. What the DASH diet is based on is several components, one of which is increasing your potassium intake and decreasing your sodium intake. And how we do this is by limiting your intake of salty food and not adding salt to food, but then also increasing your intake of fresh produce, because they are the main source of our potassium in our diet. We don't necessarily want to supplement, because as you will see just now, it can actually be a little bit dangerous, but we want to get it from food sources. And the reason we want to be careful with supplementing, unless our doctor has put us on supplements, is because potassium is exceptionally well absorbed in the digestive system. So almost all of the potassium that you take in is absorbed. And in terms of loss, you only really see massive losses if you are taking certain medications like high blood pressure medications, in which case your doctor will have put you on a slow K or something like that. And then if you are abusing laxatives as well. Then our food sources, I've already told you about them, and look how big the veggie section is. I don't know if you guys can see that very well. It looks a little bit better on that side. But in terms of potassium sources, we're talking an abundance of fresh produce, a teeny tiny little bit in dairy, and a teeny tiny little bit in some fish. But basically, we're looking at fresh produce. But do note that if you take in an excess amount of potassium, it can lead to difficulty with muscles working and contractility. Especially dangerous is an irregular heartbeat and possible death due to cardiac arrest if you take way too much. Alrighty, sorry to sound scary. Sodium. Now, this is a very interesting one because all of my clients love salt and will tell me it's very important in the body, and it really, really is, but we get a little bit too much of it. So just like I mentioned before, Potassium is inside the cells, sodium is outside the cells, and this is part of how our body works in terms of cell signaling. And it has a lot of other functions as well. Similar to potassium, it is involved in the transport of nutrients from the inside of our digestive system into the cells and then into the blood to move around the body. It is also important in the kidneys and many other tissues. Well, you can imagine it's literally everywhere inside the body. In terms of absorption, it is also beautifully absorbed. And this is because it doesn't just have one receptor, it is absorbed by multiple processes.